We are going through these different key elements or methodologies that we use in order to navigate our way through Gemorah. Do you need a copy? Okay. So, very briefly so far, what we've spoken about is pirush, which means an explanation. We've spoken about a shaila, which is a request for halachic ruling. We have spoken about a teshuvah, which is a response to a request for an halachic ruling. We have spoken about a challenge, a kashya, which is when somebody says, this is what I think, and then you say, how? How can you say that there's a verse, there's a mishnah, there's a source that seems to contradict what you're saying? And then last week we ended off with what is called an askafta, which is when somebody uses logic to derail the opinion that has been put before them. That means that so far we have looked at five of the methods that are relevant for us to understand in Gemorah. So let's see what comes next. You've got somebody who makes a statement. So let's run through the whole process. Somebody asks a shaila, what's the halacha in this case? Somebody gives them a teshuvah. They respond to that and say, I believe the halacha is X and Y. Somebody challenges that, either based on a verse or another original text, like a mishnah. So we call that a kashya, or alternatively, they challenge it with a logical challenge, which is what we call an askafta, maskif. And now we're at the point that the person has to respond. They've got to justify their opinion. So, what's that? The person who said the halacha?
The teacher.
Well, these could be colleagues. So the person who said the halacha, that has now been challenged and is now responding to the challenge, so they are going to offer what is called a pirukah. Now this is interesting because lefarek in Hebrew, and remember that Aramaic will borrow Hebrew words, actually means to take something apart, right? That's actually what it means, to take something apart. So here's a kasha, you've challenged somebody, and now that person is responding and essentially dismantling your challenge. That's what a pirukah is. They've got such a solid answer that it essentially dismantles the challenge that you put against them. Now, that pretty much means we've now settled the issue, because you presented the halacha, we did our due diligence by challenging your perspective, you were able to defend your perspective so effectively that you removed our challenge. You've now consolidated the halacha that way. So very often people tell you, I don't understand. The Gemorah has all of these conversations, but never tells us the conclusion to the conversations. And that frustrates people a lot. Well, that's because we don't necessarily have to tell you the conclusion if we have challenged something and successfully debunked the challenge. Then you know what the conclusion is. It's what the person originally said, because it stood the test. Remember, that's what Gemorah is doing. It's rigorous investigation of principles. We want to understand that what we're saying is valid. So we've done that. You made your statement, we tested it, and here it's simplistic. It sounds like one challenge, one response. It's not going to be that simplistic. There may be multiple challenges. There may be a challenge that is then challenged by somebody else, and then they have to respond to it. So sometimes you have to keep track of who's challenging who. That's where things get a little bit tricky. It's not a matter of not being able to keep track. It's a matter of mapping it out. If a person learns how to map these things out, then it's not as overwhelming as it seems. But the principle is, if you made a statement was challenged, you were able to successfully defend against that challenge, your statement is now ratified. And we now know what the halacha is. We now know practically what we're supposed to. That's the end of the story. The Gemorah can now move on to something else. It does not have to tell you, and the conclusion is. Sometimes you'll get the gift. It will tell you, Vehilchasa, this is, as you'll see in number 15, this is the halachic decision. But that's not common.
So who quietened down all the objections and now this is what he's going to... Who's like deciding that's not valid, keep quiet now?
Well, let's imagine that the conversation is happening between colleagues, even though sometimes it will be students to teachers. But all of this rigorous investigation of the principle, that is going to happen by essentially colleagues. So they'll make a presentation, they'll refute their presentation, they'll challenge the presentation.
That's not a good comment.
No, it's not. No. It's not like you're not waiting for some kind of consensus. everything's got to stand the test of rigorous interrogation. So you've got to actually be able to defend your position. It can't just be, okay, we think you've got the right idea. You've got to actually be able to defend your position.
How's it, guys? Sorry, we late. Oh, one earlier now.
Give that man a worksheet. What were we saying? Sorry.
That they've got no more capture or whatever.
Kasha.
No more challenge, kasha. Then it stops. Then it's just going to be silent. No one's going to challenge it again.
So one of two things is going to happen, right? Either it's not going to be challenged, or the challenge will be removed, dissolved. And then yes, if nobody's challenging any further, correct. If the conversation is not now, then now you know we've resolved it. We've resolved the issue.
If you answer it and no one's answering anymore, then it's over.
Correct. We are now settled. We're good. We're good.
Not now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay? We're good. So that's how you arrive at consensus. So consensus is not a lazy consensus. Consensus is a rigorous consensus. So we did our work, we had the challenge, we argued it out, we brought all the potential problems with this thing, we were able to settle those problems, now we're good. Okay? And that's what you like to find at the end of a sugya. Sugya means a section of Gemorah. That's what you'd like to find. We've got consensus. We did this. We were able to settle. Okay. Let's look at number 7. 7 is quite important.
Sorry, I don't want to hop on, but
No, it's
it
okay.
sounds like there's a statement. You're saying it doesn't. Number
There won't
6
be a
is not
statement. There won't
It's
be a
point
statement
in time.
necessarily. Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Exactly. And that's why, by the way, you made a very interesting point. Let's just go through very quickly. A Pirush and explanation will not necessarily have a specific word telling you that this is what's about to happen. A shaila, a question for halachic ruling, will have. That's why we've got key words over here. The same with an answer may not have a specific language associated with it. A kasha will have a specific word associated with it. An askafta will have a certain language associated with it. A piruka, the Gemara may not say anything. It might just be, there we go. We've dealt with this. Move on. Literally, what they call classically 2 dots, which is basically a colon, indicates the end of a sugya. This issue is now concluded, and we move on to either something associated or something unassociated.
So
sometimes.
how do you know from that the original proposition is not correct?
Again, you don't know that the original proposition is correct. You know that the last proposition that was challenged, that we have settled, is correct. Could be the original proposition is rejected. That's possible. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that gives us an opportunity to discuss something that's not on this list, and that is the principle called a hava amina. Okay? So, I knew you were going to say that, right? Yeah, hava amina. What's the hava amina? What's the hava amina? Okay, so let's understand the term. It's something we're going to deal with later on. What's that?
It's related somewhere else.
No. So we're going to deal with terminology. We're not yet at terminology. Hava amina is hava, I would have, or the truth is hava is would have, amina, I said. So you put the two together, hava amina, I would have said. And what we mean when we say a hava amina is your original understanding of a topic. And then later on we get what is called the maskana, which means the conclusion of that topic. So once we've reached this point and we have our answers, we now have a maskana, we have a conclusion of this topic, right? Whereas the hava amina, the original thought process, is not necessarily where we're going to settle. We're going to settle with the suggestion that was put forward, tested, and stood the test. Now, it's quite apt that we should bring up this issue of hava amina and maskana at this particular point in time. So, remember last week, we had the whole theoretical conversation about whether you could buy new clothes during the Omer or not. The only reason I say it was a hypothetical conversation is because this is not a halacha shir, and so you may not decide any halachic rulings from what goes on in this space.
You never tell us.
Right? Consult your local halachic authority. Okay? So
The disclaimer comes in after
the disclaimer is going to come in consistently. So now, so somebody asked the question: am I permitted to buy new clothing during the Omer. Okay?
Shaila.
What's that?
Shaila.
It's a shaila, correct. That's a shaila. Am I permitted to buy new clothing during the Omer? Now, before we go any further, let me ask you, why are you asking this question? And we touched on this last week, but I'm just taking a different approach to it now. Why are you asking this question?
Because we're in the Omer and we want to buy something.
Because, okay, but so you're in the Omer, you want to eat. Did you ask if you're allowed to eat during the Omer? You didn't. Why is the question about clothes? That's what I'm trying to be specific about. Why do you have a question about clothes? Because I heard somewhere that somebody said that you're not allowed to buy clothes during the Omer. Okay? So therefore, the Hava Amina, my original thought process was that surely this person must know what they're talking about. And therefore, there's no such thing as buying clothes during the Omer. Doesn't matter what. If every pair of your socks has holes in, darn it. I mean, as in, yeah. Okay? So, it took you guys a while. Right? So, so my Hava Amina, my original positioning thought, is that there's no such thing as buying any clothing during the Omer. And what we're going to have to illustrate is that it's not that simple. There's a reason why, as we discussed last week, there's a reason why you don't buy clothing during the Omer. It's got nothing to do with clothing. It's actually got to do with the bracha shehechiyanu. That we don't want to pronounce that bracha during this time because it says, thank God we survived to this period. It's not a great period. Not a time you're going to say, oh, Baruch Hashem, right? And then, once I know that, I realize that my Hava Amina was wrong. My original thinking was that there's something wrong with clothing. It's not. It's clothing that you celebrate. That you would say Shehechiyanu over. So very often what happens in Gemorah is we'll present something because we believe that this is the content or this is the intention of the content. And we'll resolve the issue by illustrating that you have to understand either the content or the context differently. Very often that's how we resolve something. So
setting up like a hypothesis. I believe
exactly. Hava Amina, hypothesis, exactly. And the hypothesis may be proven to be correct or may be disproven. So the fact that it's an hypothesis doesn't automatically disqualify it, but you have to know the difference between a Hava Amina, I like the word hypothesis, so you have to know the difference between a hypothesis and a maskana, a decision. Now, in a second, you're going to see why this is so important. But let's first just really robustly clarify what the difference is between a Hava Amina and a maskana. It's really, really important. Or at least the shift that can take place. Can we choose a different topic? I think we've beaten the clothes in the Omer to death. So let's do something else. Let's bring up another topic. Think of either Baba Meiser or some kind of misconception that people have about Judaism or something that you've once heard and you're curious if it's true. Anything like that. Let's try work with something like that. There you go. Exactly. Brilliant. So you bury your cutlery, yes? Raise your hand if you've ever heard that you can bury your cutlery to kasher your cutlery.
I did it as a kid.
Right? Bury your cutlery. There we go. Brilliant. So now, what's the Hava Amina? Now, when I'm asking the question, what's the Hava Amina? Don't know that the word hypothesis is going to be as clear over here. But when I ask the question in Gemorah language, we actually will speak this way. And we'll say, what's the Hava Amina? Which means, what do you think the reason is that you bury cutlery in order to kasher it? What do you think the Hava Amina is?
Sand is scraping off the...
Okay. So your Hava Amina, one second. So your Hava Amina is that there is something about the sand that can somehow scrape off the non-kosher.
Same as if you bust. If you haven't got water, you can bust with sand.
Okay, good point. So if you need to wash your hands and there's no water available, under certain circumstances, you can rub your hands against sand in order to clean your hands. Good. So the Hava Amina is that there's something about the properties of sand that can somehow purify things. Do you have a different Hava Amina?
For me, it was that you can actually bury it to make it kosher. The actual principle, not how it works or why it works, but the fact that you can do it.
Okay, but my question is, so what are you saying? That you were surprised that you could do
No,
it?
I'm saying I've heard that you can do it.
Yes. So for you, that's the question. Is that true?
Not really how it works, but can you do it?
Fine, but the two are linked.
Yeah, well, if you, yeah.
No. You'll see why the two are linked. If I understand why this should even be a hava amina, if I understand why there should even be a thought that you can somehow kasher something by burying it, then once you understand why that should be a thought, then you can actually answer the question. That's why I'm asking, what's the method? What's happening over here?
So I would have done it the other way. I would have said, if you can bury it, then there must be a reason why.
Fine. So I'm harping a little bit on the word bury over here, because if we understand what burial does to an item, then we can determine if burial is a method you could use to kasher. Okay? So you can come from either angle. It doesn't really make a difference. So you want to reincarnate. Oh, there we go. You're going to reincarnate your cutlery as kosher cutlery. It died as treif cutlery, and now it's being reincarnated or resurrected as kosher cutlery. There you go. So there's the hava amina.
Because I was in trouble using the wrong.
So you just went and buried in the garden. Quickly.
I hate to see what else you got buried in.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a little bit nervous, right?
All right. So the question is this. The question is, how do you kasher things generally? What's the principle of kashering? A mikveh can never kasher something. A mikveh can purify something from impurity, but a mikveh cannot make something that is treif kosher. Thank you. Okay, they even more.
Reverse the method that caused it.
Correct. You have to apply the same method through which it became non-kosher. You have to apply the same method in order to make it kosher, which means if I have this cup and I pour cold milk into this cup is not now considered a dairy cup, because there's nothing that can allow the cold milk to enter into the walls of this cold cup scientifically, just because it happens to be in a container. So pour out the milk, rinse out the cup, and after that you could use it for meat. But if there's heat allows the molecules to move, which makes things more porous, and allows now the possibility that the molecules of the hot stuff, let's say it was hot coffee, can now be absorbed into the wall of the cup. And if next I put in chicken soup, also hot, it again will loosen up the molecular structure, and it will allow the interaction between what's inside the wall of the cup and inside the soup, and now I've got a problem. So if the way that something became non-kosher involved heat, then the way that I kasher it has to involve heat.
So nothing involved sand.
There is nothing in sand that has the element of heat. Boba Maisa except. There's one exception. So I'll take a knife and I jam the knife into the ground and pull it out, and jam it back into the ground and pull it out. I'm going to create friction. And the friction will generate heat. Not heat to the extent of a blowtorch or an urn or whatever, but enough heat in the case of a knife to be able to kasher a knife. So it is a b'maisa to bury your cutlery. You have to create that friction by thrusting it in and out of the soil continuously. Okay? 10, I think it's 10, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's 10 times. You've got to go 10 times into the thing.
All goes in. You can't do part of it.
Correct.
You can do part of it.
No, you'd have to the whole...
The whole story.
Yeah. Tovel has got nothing to do with treif. Toveling in a mikveh has got nothing to do with treif. It's got nothing to do with treif. That's what I'm saying. It's a different halacha. It's not to do with being treif. It's got to do with whether we're allowed to use things that were produced, manufactured without being manufactured by a Jewish person.
And that is the conclusion that it will actually generate heat.
Friction. So not heat in the classic sense, but yes, it will generate the heat of friction, which is enough to kasher it. Now, the hava amina that we had, only a knife, correct? Only a knife because of the sharp blade. So it will go into the ground fast enough to create the friction. Okay. Okay, so why am I using this example? Remember, this is not a halacha shir. The hava amina, the original thought that we had was we believed originally that somehow burial has the properties of kashering. That was our hava amina. That was our assumption. When we did a robust interrogation of these principles, we realized it has absolutely nothing to do with the magical properties of burial. It's a very pragmatic thing of creating friction, because friction is a form of heat, and heat can be used to kasher. So now we've rejected our hava amina, and we have now come to a maskana. We've come to a conclusion that it's a whole different ball game to what we believed. Okay? An example. It's not the only example. Now here's something really, really, really important to remember when learning Gemorah. Really, really important. Gemorah will often present a hava amina, go through a whole robust investigation of that hava amina, as if we believe that it's going to be the correct answer. And then exactly at the end say, but boom, here's what smashes that completely, and therefore we have to go down a different route. Why would the Gemorah do this? Because we need clarity. We need to be able to know that the first principle we thought is actually not relevant. You can only know what works if you have excluded what does not work. Okay? And you've got to be thorough in doing this.
You've got to elucidate it so we can see it.
Correct. So you might go through 3 pages of Gemorah
We've been for a few months.
only focused on a hava amina that will never see the light of halachic day.
My question will happen is, why don't they just tell us that from day one?
Again, why don't they tell you from day one? Because this is not the Shulchan Aruch. This is not the how to live Jewish. This is the how to think Jewish. This is the part of the Torah that tells us how you go through a process to be absolutely clear that what is the correct answer is the correct answer. Because you know what? If we don't do this, some Chacham is going to ask exactly that question at some point 200 years down the line.
It's the literature review.
Of?
It's the literature review. You've set out again.
Yes,
I'm
exactly.
going back to the hypothesis.
Exactly.
Now I've said this is the way it should be, and why you're now debunking it.
Exactly. So that when you arrive at a conclusion, you are so confident in your conclusion. Now here comes the best part, or maybe the most tricky part, of the hava amina maskana interaction. If I'm learning a piece of Gemorah, and the first 10 lines of the page study a hava amina, and then from that we work on the maskana, meaning the first 10, I'm just using arbitrarily, 10 lines, talk about the hypothesis. And then the next 10 lines talk about the conclusion, which is completely different, possibly even opposite to the hypothesis. I'm going to learn through the whole page, and then I'm going to decide, let's go see what Rashi and what Tosfos have to say about this page. And I'm going to see Rashi or Tosfos making a comment on the first 10 lines of the Gemara and say, but don't they know the conclusion? How could they explain the way that they're explaining? We know the conclusion is not this way. We know this is just a hava amina. Yeah, of course. That's their job. Their job is to explain things as they stand in the Gemara, not to explain things as they will be concluded in the Gemara. So when you're studying, you have to remember at what stage of the page are we on. So I should expect the commentaries on the page to speak in that language as if they don't know the next line. Now, anybody who's familiar with Rashi and Tosfos and the other classic commentaries, but Rashi and Tosfos in particular, the way that they write their commentary, you can see that they have this bird's eye view of the entire Gemara at their fingertips, and yet they have that degree of mastery that when they're speaking about this line, they speak about it as if you don't know the next line. That's how they will comment. They will comment in the now rather than comment in the now versus how to be concluded later. And that can sometimes be quite frustrating for a person. It's like, but I already saw the conclusion. Like, why am I going backwards? Well, because that's the job of a decent commentator, is to explain things as they stand when you're learning that particular part. So you always have to remember that. Okay? So part of the methodology that we can use to shift ourselves from a hava amina to a maskana, from an hypothesis or a first suggestion to a conclusion, is what's listed here as number 7, a shinuya. Now, shinuya, sometimes the Gemara will use the word, at least in a variant form. It will speak about shani la, which means he revamped or reconstituted what was being said. Now, the word shani actually means to respond, Because what we're doing with a shinuya is, you can hear in it the Hebrew word, if you're familiar with the Hebrew word shinui means a change, a shift, a difference.
Is that how you can do something on Shabbos?
Yeah, with a shino, you do it in a different way. Do it in a different way, right? So, unfortunately, some people also take that out of context and they allow themselves to do things which you're not permitted to do on Shabbos because they're doing it in a different way.
I was at a friend's house on Shabbos and the alarm went off. Behind his back, he switches it off. Well, like, what are you doing? No.
Shino. Okay. So we won't get into the halachic ramifications of when you may or may not use a shino on Shabbos. But suffice to say, I don't think he made the correct decision. So, in any event, what a shinoi does is it basically shifts our perspective or our understanding of a topic, like we've just done, right? We thought that burial is the method of kashering, and we had to change that perspective by revisiting what the principle of kashering is, which is associated with heat. And from that, we could relate heat to friction. And it has nothing to do with burial and nothing to do with resurrecting new cutlery or the properties of sand or any of those things. Now, this is something that will often happen in Gemorah, very often, where the Gemorah will be able to successfully illustrate to us that the only reason we had a problem with a particular statement was because we were reading it from an angle, or we were reading the source material from an angle, and we didn't have the correct perspective. So once I can create that shinuya, I can shift the perspective, then I don't even have to answer the question anymore because you're now also seeing it differently, so you don't have that issue. This often happens in human interactions, right? So you're supposed to meet somebody for an appointment, and now it's 5 minutes past the time that they were supposed to get to you, and they're not there. So your perspective right now is, this person is so inconsiderate, they could have let me know, they're never on time, it's irresponsible, they don't value my time, blah, 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 whatever. Next thing, the person sends you a message, Mazel Tov, it's a boy. Shinuya. Everything changes. He doesn't now have to also apologize for not coming. Why do you have to apologize? You've shifted the whole narrative. Everything's completely different to what I thought, what I was concocting in my mind. The only reason I had an issue with him was because I saw it from this particular angle. Now you've changed the angle. There's no room for a question anymore. Sometimes that is the very best way to answer a question, a challenge, a pushback. Just shift the entire perspective. And the Gemorah will do that at times. The Gemorah will show you, yes, you thought that X was supposed to mean Y, but that's because you didn't have the perspective. Sometimes I'll give you an example that the Gemorah uses. Very interesting example. Sometimes the Gemorah will say, that's them, this is us. Okay? It's an interesting response that the Gemorah will make. That's them, this is us. Now you need to understand a little bit of the Jewish geopolitics of the time to appreciate what that means. That's them, this is us. Because there's a little kind of like a subtext that runs through the Gemorah at times that acknowledges the fact that there were two Talmuds, remember? There's a Talmud Yerushalmi and a Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, which means there were two communities. There was an Israeli community and there was a Babylonian community. And there were certain things that were different culturally or even physically between the two communities that influenced how halacha played out in those two places. I was just going to say, in our world, what's the closest thing we have to that? Rice on Pesach. It's the closest thing we have. That's them, this is us. In other words, is there an halachic issue with rice on Pesach? No, there's no halachic. The Torah said you may not eat chometz. Rice is not chometz. In their culture, in their history, rice was a staple part of their food intake. If they did not have rice, they wouldn't eat. We, in our reality, rice was used to produce rice cakes, I don't know exactly what, that looked very similar to chometz. We didn't need it. It wasn't a staple part of our diet. Different approach. Once you see that, that's them, this is us, changes your perspective. Nobody asked your personal. Right? But you understand what I'm getting at? We'll often do that. Often we'll say, you read the verse in the Torah, but you didn't know that there's actually an alternate reading of that verse. Now that sounds a bit dangerous, right? The minute you say that there's different ways you could read the scriptures, that sounds a bit dangerous. But here, let me give you an example. So at this time of the year, we learn, there's a tradition between Pesach and Shavuos to learn the Gemorah Soita. In the Gemorah Soita, it was either today or yesterday's page. The Gemorah was today's page. The Gemorah asks this question. No, it's not an asking for halachic. It's a little bit of a. Technically, it's a shayla, except it's a little bit of a different style of Gemara because it's not an halachic Gemara, and we'll see in a moment that not in a moment. We'll see at some point that there's a difference between an halachic Gemara and a non-halachic Gemara. This happens to be a non-halachic Gemara, where it's basically asking about human conduct, and it wants to know what's greater, if you serve Hashem out of love or if you serve Hashem out of fear, and so therefore, and then it brings a whole lot of different verses, and one of the verses has in it the word loy. What does loy mean? What does loy mean? Yes? I just want to get consensus. Hello, this is Talmudic. Can we just get consensus here? Loy means no or not. How do you spell it? Lamed Aleph. Now there's another version. Yeah, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, exactly. Exactly. So now, do you know another variant of the spelling of that word? Lamed Vav. What does Lamed Vav mean?
Him, you.
Correct. Him or his?
Duolingo.
Did you ever see that thing of the guy who goes to another country and speaks Duolingo? I have nice watermelon. Anyway, so there's two versions of the word loy, with an aleph and with a vav. So what's the? I'm not going to use the pasuk in today's Gemara. I'll use another one that's a bit more well known. It says b'chol tzarasam loy tzar. Now, depending on how you spell the word loy, it's going to make the verse have a completely different meaning. The one variation is b'chol tzarasam, in all the distress that the Jewish people have, loy tzar. Hashem also has distress, which makes it sound obviously that Hashem is very close to us and very embedded in our experiences, because if we're in distress, He's in distress. Sounds beautiful. But if it's spelt with an aleph, it's the exact opposite message. B'chol tzarasam, in all of their distress, loy tzar, He has no distress. The exact opposite meaning. So that's what. So now, thank you very much. You got to go look in the Torah and see how it's spelled, right? And how's it spelled? With an aleph. Oy vey. What a horrible message. In all of our distress, He has no distress. Nothing to Him. Comes along the Gemorah and tells us that there is something in Torah which is really interesting, called Kri and Ksiv. You ever heard of this? Kri and Ksiv. There are certain words in the Torah, and you can only know this if you have a tradition that is correct, not read or written. That you can only know this if you have an unbroken tradition that dates right back to Moshe Rabbeinu. You cannot make this stuff up. It's got to have real, tradition associated with it. That sometimes the way that a word is written versus the way that it is read are not the same. So it's written as loy, and you read it as loy. Now you can't hear the difference, but your intention and the meaning of the verse completely different. The written word is, Hashem is way beyond feeling our pain. He's infinite. We're finite. What do you mean? The message, loy, He takes it on personally. So there's a shinuya. We're shifting our perspective from the obvious to the implied. That would be an example. The Gemara does a similar thing over here, which speaks about love and fear of Hashem. Does a similar kind of thing with the pasuk. It's basically saying you think that the pasuk means X, but actually instead of the Aleph, it's the Vav, and therefore it's telling us that the person who serves Hashem out of love has this tremendous relationship with Hashem. So that is a method that the Gemara will use in a variety. That's one example, showing that the way you've read the verses is not the only way to read it. But we could do the same, change the context, explain. Any time that we're shifting your perspective, it's got to be a valid reason to shift your perspective. Shifting your perspective to the extent that you no longer have your question, that's a very powerful way to respond when somebody's raised an issue. Okay? Got it? Makes sense? All right. Number 8. Tiyufta. What's that?
Still stuck on the previous
Which one?
tradition and meaning.
It's a big subject, right?
Big subject.
Big subject. It's one of the key distinguishers of Judaism versus other scriptural religions, because we have very clear traditions about how to read. And if you don't have these traditions, how on earth could you read? So I'll just give you one more example, not of a shinuya, but just of a tradition. The Torah tells us on 3 different occasions, Loi sevashel gedi b'chalev imoy. Directly translated, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. You ever heard this before? Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. How do you say milk in Hebrew? Chalav. In Hebrew, when words are attached to other words, like in English, you might hyphenate a word. So when words are attached to another word, in Hebrew, the voweling will change. So chalav on its own is chalav, but chalav imo actually becomes chalev imo. Okay, fine. In halacha, there are 2 kinds of fats inside an animal's body. One kind of fat is kosher. One kind of fat is non-kosher. It's one of the reasons we generally don't use the hind quarter. It's not the only reason. The bigger reason is the sciatic nerve. But this is also part of the issue, is that there's certain chalev fats that are not kosher. So that's what it's called. Kosher fats are called shumon, which is the generic title for fat. And non-kosher fats are called chalev, which is a very unique kind of fats that only appear in certain parts of the anatomy. The word chalev, which is non-kosher fat, and the word chalav, which is milk, are spelt identically. And the Torah is written without vowels. So how do I know that the Torah is telling me do not cook a kid in its mother's milk, when perhaps it's saying do not cook a kid in its mother's fat? How do I know? There is no scriptural way to know which one it is. You have to have a tradition. Without that tradition, one of the most core halachic parts of Judaism, kosher food, would be completely different if we didn't know which the tradition was. Or it'd be completely ambiguous if we didn't know what the tradition was. So there's just another illustration of this point. It's not a shinuya, but just because we touched on this idea of having to have a tradition of how you read, it's incredibly important.
Is that the only place that mentions milk and meat?
Well, there's 3 different occasions, but it's all 3 spelt the same way. So you've got the same problem 3 times over.
Was that a Mishnah that they actually debated or not?
What, the pronunciation?
No, milk versus fat.
How
do they get to the conclusion of that?
Good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if it's actually debated in the Gemorah. It's just like so clearly taken that that's what it is. Okay. It happens to be one of the big Gemorahs, like a big, thick, technical Gemorah called Chulin that goes into all of these details, but I don't believe the actual argument is there. Okay? All right, let's round off with a tiyufta. Tiyufta. Can you see over here? Can you see the little red writing there? Little red writing hood. Okay, so what does it say? I know, I was just thinking, as I'm looking around the table, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this font is way too small. Okay, anyway, what I'm illustrating over there is that the word tiyufta, you can see, is linked grammatically to the word asive or mesive or mesiv. Where did we have those words? Kashya. Tiyufta means my kashya is irrefutable. That's what tiyufta means. That's why it's the same word. So I challenged somebody based on a primary source. They could not defend themselves against that challenge. The Gemorah will then say, Tiyufta de so-and-so, which means checkmate. Actually means check. Checkmate is Tiyufta de so-and-so, Tiyufta. When I put the Tiyufta on either side of his name, then you know, that's it. Game, set, match. It's over.
You mean the first one is still maybe...
The first one could still be responded to. Tiyufta de, we have now brought a very strong case to challenge so-and-so's opinion, and he could still come back from that. It's possible. But if the Gemara says Tiyufta de so-and-so, Tiyufta, done. Game over. That is the Gemara telling you in no uncertain terms that this opinion is no longer seen as the halachic perspective.
What did the English do?
It has been refuted. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting about it, that just to really make life a little bit more fun, the direct translation of the word tiyufta, if you were to translate it into Hebrew, would actually be teshuvah. How's that for an interesting thought? So just to give you an example, so there's an expression that says that when Mashiach comes, Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'asava tzadikaya. What do you hear in the word? Tzadikaya. Tzadik. Be tiyufta. Which means in the future when Mashiach comes, Hashem will get the tzaddikim to do teshuvah. The word that it uses there in that statement for teshuvah is tiyufta. The same statement over here. Because what does teshuvah mean? It means to return to a status quo. And over here, somebody's presented an idea. We've now completely rejected the idea, so we go back to the status quo, which may have been no answer. It could be we didn't know whether that might be the status quo. But the point is, teshuvah, we're returning to a point where this answer is no longer part of the consideration.
What do you mean by a ruling? What is a ruling? A ruling. The ruling's a ruling.
So again, you asked a shaila. You asked me for an halachic ruling. I gave the halachic ruling. You responded with a kashya. And now your kashya stands and my ruling falls.
Okay. That refers to number 2 as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because remember, the shaila got us to the teshuvah, which got us to the kashya, which now has, in this particular case, has ended in a tiyufta.
I thought it was in terms of number 6, in terms of the resolution, but no, it's in terms of the original ruling.
Correct. Yeah. All right. We shall leave all support for next week. Please contact Talmud support next week.